So, moving back to France now, in the late 1860s and 70s, a new generation of young painters would continue to paint images of modern life. However, they were less interested in exacting or realistic portrayals and in overt political or social commentary than Manet or Courbet's generation. These artists instead focused on pretty landscapes and scenes of modern upper-class leisure in both urban and rural settings. Many of these young artists were friends who gathered regularly at the Café Gerbois, and they were very eager to sort of socialize and share ideas about art. And so it was here that they met Manet, and they really began to look to him as sort of a philosophical leader. So in 1874, a group of about 30 of these artists joined together as the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers. They agreed that none of them would submit work to the official salon that year, and instead, in a declaration of their independence, they hosted an alternate exhibition of more than 200 works. This exhibition would give the group its name, and it would become the first of 8 Impressionist exhibitions between 1874 and 86, with varying members of the group participating. Although these artists worked in individual and sometimes vastly different styles, they were united in their rejection of the formal approaches to art maintained by the Paris Academy and Salon. Many of these artists also began painting in plein air, completing compositions in the open air rather than making studies outdoors and then using those to create a final composition later in their studio. This was possible thanks to a couple of mid-19th century innovations, including portable easels and, more importantly, pre-mixed paints that were sold in collapsible metal tubes, so artists could finally easily pack and take their tools outside of the studio. Working outdoors in direct kind of sunlight and from direct observation, these artists were able to note how colors, light, and shadows in nature are sort of constantly in flux, and they sought to capture the effects before the moment changed using quick strokes without putting in many details and by applying colors in a way that captured the play of quickly shifting light across a scene. These artists trusted their own empirical observations to choose colors that matched nature, but they also looked to science. The physicist Hermann Helmholtz had discovered that white light, or daylight, divides into a prism of colors. The local color, or the sort of inherent color of an object, is modified by the quality of light in which it is viewed. Nothing is just one single color in nature. Instead, we see various hues in individual objects and across forms because our retina perceives various color sensations as light refracts off of the objects back into our eyes. Science also taught artists that shadows in nature aren't black, but they have color, often the complement of the color of the object that's casting the shadow. And so these Impressionists, they divided their colored paints, they sort of divided their colors according to Helmholtz's spectrum, and they used very free brushstrokes that sort of animate the surface with visible touches of paint, placing an array of colors side by side instead of blending them, and this technique is sometimes described as broken color or broken brushwork. So while these Impressionists were undeniably interested in depicting modern life, their true interest was in capturing the, quote, impression of an ephemeral scene. This means they sought to sort of record the various fleeting sensations of color and light, and they explored how to convey the fast-paced and ever-changing aspects of modern life instead of accurately describing the physical substance of the forms and the spaces that they occupied. So at their first exhibition in 1874, one critic, Louis Leroy, ridiculed this particular painting, which is titled Impression Sunrise by Claude Monet, who was a leading proponent of the group. Monet was born in Paris, but he had been raised in the port city of Le Havre, and he was very much committed to creating a modern painting style without the social or political commentary of realism. Monet was one of the first to begin painting in plein air, and he developed a much brighter palette and a lighter tonal range than the browns, blacks, and dark chiaroscuro of the old masters. Rather than using dark grounds, he began to paint with pale ones, often gray, cream, or beige, and this helped the lighter colors appear more luminous. So here he's used quite broad strokes of color to depict a sunrise on a foggy morning over the harbor in Le Havre. The foreground is rather ambiguous, and the horizon line really disappears in the thick atmosphere of mist and amongst the sketchy, shifting forms of the ships and the docks in the background. The critic Leroy ridiculed the fast, open brushstrokes as tongue lickings, and he deemed that this work, as well as the others in the exhibition, were maybe preliminary sketches, but not finished paintings. In a satirical review, he borrowed from Monet's title and he labeled the entire exhibition Impressionist. And even though he meant that in a derogatory way, Monet and the others really embraced the term because they felt that it accurately described their goal of capturing the instantaneous impression of a fleeting moment in paint. Leroy also mocked this painting by Monet titled The Boulevard des Capucines. Of this, he said, quote, "Tell me what those innumerable black tongue lickings in the lower part of the picture represent." Now, today we sort of easily read the shorthand of Monet's quick brushstrokes, and we can understand basically everything in this picture, including trees, buildings, horse-drawn carriages, blurred pedestrians, and this cluster of pink balloons kind of down here in the pedestrian crowd. Monet once explained to one of his students, he says, quote, "When you paint, try to forget what objects you have before you. Merely think, here is a little square of blue, here an oblong of pink, here a streak of yellow, and paint it just as it looks to you, the exact color and shape until it gives your own naive impression of the scene before you," end quote. Now, the sort of high viewpoint and the asymmetrical perspective that Monet has adopted here, these are sort of evocative of Japanese prints, which he and several other Impressionists collected, and so we'll look at that a little bit more specifically in a few minutes. Monet used the term instantaneity for his goal of rendering the ephemeral effects of light and weather. He said, "For me, a landscape hardly exists as a landscape because its appearance is constantly changing. It lives by virtue of its surroundings, the air and the light, which vary continually." Monet developed a practice of painting in series, using the repetition of a motif under natural conditions to sort of demonstrate this instantaneity. For example, this series of about 25 canvases was painted between the summer of 1890 and the spring of 1891 near Monet's home in Giverny, France. All of these canvases share a similar composition of these huge stacks of wheat surrounded by fields, hills, and the sky with small sort of farm buildings in the distance. Now, though each of these is slightly different in perspective, the real differences are in the individual variations of light and color. Each canvas conveys a specific season, time of day, and weather condition. And so Monet's year-round daily routine involved bringing numerous easels and canvases outdoors and working on each of them successively as the day progressed from dawn until dark. So here are two kind of examples from that series. We have a winter scene and a summer scene here. So in the winter scene, which is on the left, Monet has used sort of a muted color palette, and he kind of reveals many tones beyond the white local color of the snow. Instead, he uses warm pinks in the areas that he observed direct sunlight, and then blues for the reflected light in areas of shadow. On the right, in the summer scene, he's included a bright assortment of tones in blue, lavender, and green. And he employs sort of various brush strokes in both, including longer, smoother ones, shorter, choppier ones, and raised, kind of overlapping dabs that create a rather thickly textured paint surface, which we call impasto. Similarly, between about 1892 and 94, Monet painted a series of more than 30 canvases depicting ruined cathedral. He rented a space across from the cathedral, and he worked on multiple canvases successively according to what time of day it was. Now, this wasn't meant as an expression of personal religious belief. Rather, he was merely fascinated with the way that light played across the stone surface, kind of changing its appearance constantly. Here are a few more examples. And so again, he's really trying to define the ephemeral quality of light and capture different weather conditions. This case, however, is a little bit different because Monet continued to work on these paintings in his studio, really refining them into much more carefully finished works than some of his earlier plein air canvases. And so this series was meant to be exhibited together so that people could really see and understand these changing kind of optical effects of light on the very sort of heavy three-dimensional form of the cathedral. So in contrast, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, he focused his attention not on landscapes, but on figures, and he produced mostly scenes of modern middle-class leisure. Renoir was a successful figure painter trained at the École des Beaux-Arts when he met Monet in 1862. Monet really encouraged him to paint in plein air, to lighten his color palette, and to try and capture those optical effects of color and light. Renoir went on to combine this spontaneous handling of natural light and color with very animated figural compositions that convey modern urban life using many different kinds of brushstrokes. He ranges from sort of long and smooth to short and choppy strokes, and he also uses dabs of thick impasto. So in this work from 1876, he's depicted a crowd of people enjoying themselves at a rather popular dance hall in Paris. It was called Les Moulins de la Gaillette, which sort of translates to the pancake mill. And so this dance hall, they opened an outdoor courtyard during good weather, and so that's what we're seeing here. Renoir has interspersed working class clientele with very attractive sort of bourgeoisie figures, largely based on his own friends and fellow artists. But his figures sort of casually chat and laugh and dance. And so he really emphasizes the informal sociability and the spontaneity as sort of being characteristic of urban modern life. Notice how he really uses kind of smaller, more controlled brush strokes to clarify details in the figures' heads and in the furniture near the foreground. But really, most of the figures and forms are suggested with kind of loose, rapid strokes. And so we have various colors that play across forms, including blues and purples in the shadows, and yellows, pinks, and reds in the more illuminated areas. Renoir's rapid brushwork and complex broken colors create this illusion of dappled light sort of shifting through the leaves and playing across the forms, and that really helps to convey the lively, carefree moment as it dissolves into the next one. Here's another example. This work is The Luncheon of the Boating Party. It's one of Renoir's larger paintings, again showing upper middle class leisure, but now a bit more outside of the city at this sort of floating restaurant. So for this work, as with his Moulin de la Gaillette, Renoir has had several of his bourgeoisie friends and fellow artists pose. So the seated sleeveless man, that is actually Gustave Caillebotte, who was another artist within this Impressionist circle. And then the woman with the dog across from him, that was actually Renoir's girlfriend at the time. So while this scene is again full of color and light kind of playing across these various forms, these forms are a bit more solid and three-dimensional than, say, Monet's forms. And that really sort of reflects that Renoir sort of doubted the aesthetic durability of the Impressionist style, and he ultimately brings more traditional ideas back in. For Renoir, though, the essence of art was very closely related to the idea of like aesthetics and beauty. He once said, quote, "For me, a picture should be a pleasing thing, joyful and pretty. Yes, pretty. There are quite enough unpleasant things in life without the need for us to manufacture more." So the only female artist included in the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874 was Berthe Morisot. Morisot was an upper-class woman, an upper-middle-class woman, really, and she had received a private art education growing up in Paris. Morisot had participated in about 7 state salons prior to her involvement with the Impressionists, and it was there that she met Edward Manet in about 1868. They became quite good friends, and she actually sat for him several times, which was uncommon for a woman of her status. In 1874, she married Manet's brother, Eugene, and that was the same year that she submitted 9 original paintings to the first Impressionist exhibition. And then she would go on to participate in 7 of the 8 total exhibitions. Of Morisot, Manet allegedly once said, quote, "This woman's work is exceptional. Too bad she's not a man." And so this kind of speaks to, I think, Morisot's experience as a female artist during the time. She was generally considered an equal by her fellow Impressionists, yet critics and the general public often described her increasingly fluid and painterly style as charming, delicate, and feminine, and so she wasn't taken super seriously. Despite producing more than 860 paintings, her death certificate claimed that she had no profession. Now, like the other Impressionists, Morisot gravitated towards modern subject matter, but because of her gender, she couldn't visit many of the modern places her male counterparts visited to find modern subjects. So instead, she tended to focus on creating rather intimate depictions of the lives of modern women. Most of her scenes are domestic in setting. So on the left here, we have a portrait of the artist's mother and sister. Now, both sisters copied paintings at the Louvre and studied with several teachers and exhibited works in the official salons while they were growing up. However, when her sister Edma married in 1869, she gave up painting to devote herself to domestic duties, while Berthe Morisot continued her artistic career even after she was married and after she gave birth to her daughter in 1879. In this particular portrait, I think, especially in the sister's face, we get a sense of almost profound boredom. Her mother seems more resigned to this lifestyle, or at least she's found a way to kind of work within the confines of her domestic situation and kind of, perform activities befitting to a respectable kind of upper-class lady. Now, on the right here, we have an 1872 work titled The Cradle. And so here, Morisot focuses in on the mother. She's obscured the infant baby with this sort of gauzy lace over the crib. So we're not focused on it, but instead we kind of hone in on the mother's intent focus and her caring gaze and the way she sort of plays with the edge of the lace, almost as if she is completely engrossed by this baby. It makes for a really tender scene. I believe this is Morisot's sister and her sister's child, although there is sort of a level of personal sentiment here as well, maybe speaking to how Morisot herself juggled both professional success and an undeniable devotion to her family. So this 1879 work titled Summer's Day, this is an example of the types of modern urban leisure scenes that Morisot often created. So here we have two young bourgeoisie ladies enjoying a sunny afternoon in this little boat on a lake in a park in Paris. Morisot painted this in plein air while sitting in the boat with these models. She really was one of the freest Impressionists, as indicated here by her prominent kind of painterly brushwork. She's really applied paint in distinct kind of zigzagging patterns to create the desired sketchy finish. She uses strokes of white, blue, and lime green across the surface of the water to suggest reflective light. And the overall composition is very luminous, and it creates the sort of desired impression of spontaneity through its rather unfinished quality and the cut-off composition. So although Impressionists commonly sought to produce images that looked as if the artist had captured life on the wing, or an impression of an ephemeral scene kind of casually happened upon and perceived in an instant, not all of them painted so quickly or in plein air while observing scenes directly. Some of them, like Edgar Degas, instead produced the appearance of spontaneity and randomness by using considerable calculation in their studio-based practice to construct seemingly accidental poses and positions. Degas himself, he really thought of himself more as a realist. He saw himself as an observer and a painter of everyday modern experience. And that is true. But because of his ability to suggest a quick moment in time, art historians typically place him within Impressionism. Now, Degas was especially drawn to leisure and entertainment venues in modern Paris. He regularly attended the opera, the ballet, the theater, horse races, and more, making sketches and studies which he then took back to his studio and used to compose larger scenes that look like quick glimpses of the fast-paced, ever-changing qualities of modern life. Generally, Degas focused on the working class entertainers, though, rather than the bourgeoisie audiences. He was especially drawn to the ballet in the 1870s and the 80s, and while he sometimes did draw or paint actual dancers in rehearsal, he often also hired young dancers, which he called ballet rats, and he had them come to his studio and pose for him. And so that's the case for this scene from about 1874, which is titled The Rehearsal on Stage. So here he's carefully constructing the composition to be visually interesting and appealing, but he's also communicating the reality of modern life. Several of these dancers seem bored or just simply exhausted. Some of them stretch, kind of trying to wake up their tired limbs. One of them is yawning. So he's really speaking to the physical toll of performance on these young ballerinas. He also references the common belief that because most ballerinas were from sort of lower class families and they wore these quote-unquote skimpy costumes out in public, they were widely assumed to be sexually available, and they often attracted the attention of wealthy men who would financially support them in exchange for sexual favors. And so Degas has included over to the right these two well-dressed men who are kind of slouching in their chairs, probably meant to be some of the wealthy protectors of these dancers. Degas had a rather inventive approach to pictorial compositions. So here in this rehearsal scene from, again, about 1874, he's really rejecting European conventions that placed subjects perfectly centered in compositions that receded through space with mathematical regularity. Instead, he really deviates from the rules of linear perspective, using tipped-up planes with figures at the edges. Here he presents a scene from kind of this slightly elevated vantage point. He compresses the pictorial space, and he uses an asymmetrical arrangement of forms. The wide central area of the floor is empty, and it seems to sort of loom upwards, animated, honestly, by these kind of looping shadows that are cast by the dancers that are concentrated to the upper left and the lower right of the scene. And then the teacher is standing, she's wearing red, kind of standing in the far back right. Now, if this followed academic rules, the teacher would probably be the central focus, with perspective lines converging on their form. But instead, Degas doesn't center any one subject. He cuts the dancers off at the edges of the scene, and the attention that he gives to the periphery of the scene really implies that this painting only shows a fragment of the larger world that continues beyond the edges of the canvas, and it only shows one kind of instantaneous moment of time. Here's another example. This one is titled The Orchestra at the Opera. So this time, Degas depicts musicians in the orchestra pit, which was part of the performance, but it was not what the audience was there to see, and so it was usually sort of hidden down in front of the stage. It wouldn't have been considered an appropriate subject for artists. However, the bassoonist that's shown pretty prominently here, he was a friend of Degas, and then the artist also knew some of the other people in the orchestra as well, so it becomes somewhat of a group portrait, but it's also just another glimpse into the reality of these modern performers. Notice how the dancers on the stage near the top of the painting have been cut off, even though these are what the people in the audience would have come to see. Also, sort of in the midground, we have these somewhat strange silhouettes of instruments that jut upwards into the scene. Now, these things may not seem entirely strange to us, but they would have been incredibly bizarre and even comical to 19th century viewers. But keep in mind, these are not mistakes. Rather, Degas has carefully constructed his composition to appear spontaneous. Now, one important influence on Degas' radical approach to compositional arrangements and to his sort of interest in depicting quick moments in time, one important influence was photography. And so as processes and products became more simplified and accessible, photography became a hobby for millions of people, not just academically trained artists. And so where earlier photographers really sought to imitate the styles and genres of traditional visual art, amateurs and hobbyists took quicker, less staged pictures of casual subjects of everyday life. And so as more people began to own and operate cameras, fewer and fewer had any art training, and so we start to see these unplanned elements in backgrounds. We see odd angles and vantage points, figures and forms sort of at the edges of the frame that have been cropped off, and so this really results in a totally new aesthetic of candid or snapshot photography, and that's something that Degas was very interested in and tried to sort of imitate within his paintings. In addition to photography, Degas was also highly influenced by Japanese prints. Now, I've mentioned Japanese art and prints a few times in this week's lectures, so let me take a moment here to sort of explain that context. So after Commodore Matthew Perry led the United States naval warships to forcibly open Japanese ports to global trade in 1853, Japanese screens, fans, silk kimonos, bronzes, and prints flooded into Europe and the United States and set off this fashion craze for all things Japanese, which is often referred to by the French term Japonism. Now, this is a term that was coined in 1872, and it kind of refers to this European love for all things Japanese, but it's specifically referring to the fashion for Japanese art in the West and the Japanese influence on Western art and design. Now, I mentioned that Whistler was one of the first to incorporate Japanese motifs such as fans and vices into his images, which we can see here in his rose and silver, the princess from the land of porcelain. Monet also did this on occasion, such as in this portrait of his wife, which is wearing a kimono and she's surrounded by these decorative fans. Now, these types of depictions can be rather exoticizing or othering, and they sort of show that many Europeans didn't have a complete understanding of Japanese culture. However, individual artists really responded to Japanese art in different ways, depending on their own interests. So, of particular interest to many avant-garde artists who were seeking to escape European academic visual conventions were the masterful ukiyo-e woodblock prints from the Edo period Japan. These inexpensive, colorful prints were mass-produced using multiple wood blocks, one for each color. And the term ukiyo-e, it means pictures of the floating world. And so these themed images, prints and paintings, really, these took subject matter from the pleasures and beautiful sights of Edo, Japan. So the Edo period in Japan lasted from about 1603 to about 1868. And so the subjects of these works of art include the places where beautiful people live the moment without any reference to the problems of politics or the labors of reality. Ukiyo-e subjects and themes included beautiful women, kabuki actors, sumo wrestlers, scenes of leisure, and landscapes. Some of the most popular Japanese ukiyo-e printmakers in Europe during this time were Katsushika Hakusai and Utagawa Hiroshige, both of which were very well known for their landscape scenes. And then we also have Kitagawa Utamaro, who specialized in these sort of intimate snapshot scenes that focused on members of the upper class, specifically women, who could afford sort of lives of luxury. And so he did this series like toilette or maybe boudoir pictures. And so these were quite popular as well. Now, because we're dealing with woodcut prints, these tend to have a rather limited color palette. They focus on contrasting smooth and richly patterned areas, and they're highly linear, incorporating traditional flowing curves that were inspired by East Asian calligraphy. Now, in general, European audiences saw these Japanese prints as rather startling because of their distinct lack of linear perspective, the flat shapes of solid color with no shading or modeling, the economical linear outlines, and the use of bold cropping techniques, as well as asymmetrical compositions and unusual vantage points. Most of these characteristics directly contradicted with the accepted techniques of the academy art style, or the academic art style, and that made them sort of highly seductive to, again, avant-garde artists who were looking to escape those conventions. In Japanese art, Whistler found his encouragement for his purely kind of aesthetic conception of art, while Degas found complex diagonal compositional arrangements and elevated viewpoints. The subject matter of these ukiyo-e prints is also quite realistic and of the present moment, based on ideas that all is transient and fleeting, and so it connects with the ephemeral scenes of leisure and pleasure that the Impressionists also wanted to represent. In the 1880s, Degas did a series of intimate glimpses into the private lives of women rendered in pastel, and these incorporate not only the sort of asymmetry and odd vantage point of Japanese prints, but some of those popular themes as well. So these pastels by Degas, they're perhaps rather similar to Kitagawa Utamaro's prints of women in kind of private, intimate scenes. So the scenes here in both of these are rather radically tilted. So we're looking from above at a woman who on the left kind of crouches in this oddly small tub to wash her neck with a sponge. And then at the right, she stands kind of bending quite deeply to run the sponge across the bottom of the tub. There's this strange distortion of spatial relationships between the figure and the surrounding scene. and that's especially evident on the left. There, it kind of initially seems like it's two separate pictures, with the woman posed in the tub at the left, kind of balanced somewhat precariously on a rather steep floor, and then to the right we have this radically tipped up table with bathing objects on it. However, when the two parts of the scene are coordinated, they really establish the viewer's extreme, domineering vantage point sort of looming over the figure. The dramatic, flattened juxtaposition and the compression and cropping of the figure are examples of Degas' interest in both Japanese prints and photography. Degas' proficient and inventive use of pastels really relied on a rather sophisticated yet now lost fixative formula that allowed him to build up different layers of pastel. So notice how he's incorporating the gestures of mark making into these finished works. And he sometimes even allows marks to cross over forms as sort of flattening and fusing them. And he does that maybe most evidently kind of here on the left edge of the tub on the right scene where it kind of meets the floor. Another artist who exhibited with the Impressionists but deviated from them in both style and technique was the American expatriate painter and printmaker Mary Cassatt. Cassatt was born in Pittsburgh and attended the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Art between 1861 and 65 before moving to Paris in 1873, where she remained for most of the rest of her life. Cassatt met Degas at the Salon of 1870, and he was very impressed by the realism of her figures and her distaste for the tyranny of the Salon jury system, and so he invited her to join the Fourth Impressionist exhibition of 1879. Cassatt was the only American Impressionist, and aside from Berthe Morisot, she was the only other female member. Like Morisot, she was sort of limited in her subject matter because of her gender, and so Cassatt typically focused on the domestic and social lives of bourgeoisie women because that was considered more appropriate for female artists. It was something that she was familiar with, and it was something that she knew would kind of bring in a decent amount of money. So this painting, titled In the Loge from 1890 or 91, depicts a rather fashionable yet modest young woman in a loge, or a private theater box, at the Paris Opera, which was really one of the few public social spaces that bourgeoisie women could respectably attend and socialize. People went to the opera to see the show, yes, but they were also there to see and be seen by other modern audience members. Cassatt's subject here is a rather self-possessed woman, probably meant to be her sister, and she's shown maybe at intermission because the lights in the auditorium have been turned up here, and she's shown in close profile, kind of partially hidden behind these little opera glasses that she's using to look not down or forward at the stage, though, but rather across at other theater boxes, presumably at someone else in the crowd. Meanwhile, she's being gazed at in the same way by this rather cartoonish man who leans out of his box toward the upper left, and so the woman is sort of sandwiched between his gaze and that of the viewer. Cassatt is seemingly making commentary on the idea of gaze and how women were and are constantly ogled, yet she imbues her female character with a certain level of autonomy that allows her to actively view the scene as well, perhaps in a direct reference to Cassatt's own experiences as a female artist. Cassatt's loose painting technique that eliminates details really allows her to suggest a lot with very little. Notice how few brushstrokes are used to construct the figures in the background. Notice, too, how the curve of the balcony behind the woman really links to the curve of her back, connecting the background and the foreground. Although this scene may look spontaneous, which is an effect that's kind of reinforced by the very gestural brushwork here, Cassatt has actually very carefully controlled the composition. Again, she worked in her studio much like Degas did, rather than painting from direct observation. Cassatt was especially known for her extraordinarily sensitive depictions of women with children, in which she tried to counter the cliched stereotypes of her time. Now, mother and child images weren't new by any means, and here both the subject and composition recall earlier portrayals of the Virgin and Child enthroned, thus connecting this intimate, accessible image of modern motherhood to the very long-standing tradition within art history. The child's drowsy face, rosy cheeks, and weighty limbs have a highly natural quality, though the space that these figures occupy is somewhat flattened. Cassatt was primarily a figure painter, so her figures tend to have a greater sense of solidity and volume, which she then contrasts with very loosely painted clothing and settings. Notice here how her brushwork transitions from smaller and more detailed in the faces and upper bodies to looser and more gestural in the lower limbs, the clothing, and the surrounding space. Especially note the unfinished treatment of the child's feet and how the bold, sketchy strokes seem to communicate movement, as if this child is maybe actively kicking its feet in an effort to fight falling asleep. So again, there's a certain tenderness here, but not necessarily personal sentiment. Cassatt herself never married nor had children, and most of her female models were not actually related to the children that they posed with. Cassatt was also a prolific and innovative printmaker. After attending a huge exhibition of Japanese ukiyo-e prints, which was hosted by the École des Beaux-Arts in 1890, she wrote to Berthe Morisot saying, quote, "You who want to make color prints wouldn't dream of anything more beautiful. I dream of doing it myself and can't think of anything else but color on copper. You must see the Japanese come as soon as you can." Shortly after, she produced a series of etchings and aquatints using Japanese aesthetics. She created this print, titled Maternal Caress, using a rather limited color palette of harmonious tones of white, gray, yellow, and light brown. She includes no shadows and no illusion of deep space. Instead, her goal was to create a striking two-dimensional design using simplified contours and a few delicate internal lines to define her figures. The pattern of the woman's dress here really strongly contrasts with that of the wallpaper and of the chair. So again, she's kind of conveying this tender bond between mother and child. Here, the mother and child kind of form a cohesive unit as the child's arms encircle the mother's neck and the mother's arms hold the child in return. She's also placed their heads on the same level, which sort of increases that sense of intimacy. Here are two more prints from that same time, both of which adopt the momentary glimpse into the private lives of women and the sort of stylistic character of Japanese ukiyo-e prints by Utamaro and by others. So in these two prints, titled The Coiffure and Woman Bathing, respectively, Cassatt presents partially nude female figures, although not in a sexualized manner, which is not always the case for ukiyo-e prints. Instead, she emphasizes the mundane reality of the scenes and sort of focuses on the cropped, diagonally structured, asymmetrical compositions with oblique vantage points, flat, unmodulated areas of color, bold outlines, and striking visual patterns.